My name is Max. I'm one of the co-founders of Fiat DAO, a new DeFi protocol launching sometime next week, hopefully, on Ethereum. And what I'll be talking about today is kind of the case for fixed income assets in DeFi going forward, as it is kind of what we're building on top of. So to get things started, I'd like to do a quick definition of what I mean when I talk about fixed income. So fixed income assets are ones where you essentially have a known yield over time. Usually these are debt instruments where a borrower is, borrowing assets from a given protocol. There we go. Sorry about that. Borrowing assets from a given protocol with a known repayment date and a known kind of interest rate. And I've shown an example here from one of the existing DeFi fixed income protocols, Notional Finance, in which a lender is lending 100 DAI to the protocol. A borrower who has collateralized their ETH is borrowing DAI from the protocol, and then at a known point in the future is repaying that principal amount plus interest. In DeFi today, the majority of these fixed income assets are represented as zero coupon kind of proofs of liquidity. So if you've lent into one of these protocols, you would then essentially have an IOU that you can redeem at some point in the future for the amount of money you're owed. And that's kind of what we'll be focusing on today. Now, when we think about how DeFi compares to TradFi on this topic, it's quite interesting in that in TradFi, the kind of size of the fixed income market is massive globally, and it's relatively on par with the global equities market as well, around 120 trillion for both. Now, if we think about crypto and kind of the DeFi space in particular, that has not played out whatsoever. If we look at the kind of total crypto market cap, sans Bitcoin, that brings us to about 1 trillion in assets, and as of this morning, going off of DeFi Llama, there's about 45 billion in TVL in lending protocols. And of that 45 billion, a very, very tiny drop is fixed income or fixed yield. And so that kind of brings to mind, kind of these questions about why is this the case? Is this an opportunity? And what can we do to, change this dynamic? And so to give a bit of background on myself and why myself and my co-founders are working on this problem, I, as of between last year March through last year October, worked at a DeFi protocol called Barnbridge, where we were issuing kind of like these smart yield assets, where users could lock in a fixed rate over time. Now, they didn't get a lot of traction. And when we kind of dug down as to why that was the case, we kind of realized there were a few differences between how the TradFi market for these types of assets work and how it works in DeFi. So in TradFi, if you have good quality bonds, there's a ton of leverage available to you, especially when we're talking about government issued bonds. Not only that, but there is also a vast network of market makers that'll work with you to offload those bonds when you need to. Granted, if everyone tries to do it at the same time, you run into liquidity issues, but it's still a whole lot different than what we have in DeFi today. For the most part, if you take a fixed income position in DeFi, you can't really use it for collateral anywhere else. There are no real dedicated market maker networks at the moment. And for the few protocols that have kind of built toward the direction of automated market makers for these positions, they're kind of forced to fragment their liquidity across every single tenor that they might support. And so for the most part, if you're using fixed income in DeFi today, the buck kind of stops there. You hold it until maturity. Maybe you're able to sell at certain sizes, but the real bread and butter use cases you see in TradFi do not exist for the most part in DeFi, meaning it just has not been super attractive, as kind of the last slide showed, right? I think 2.5%, 3% of lending TVLs in fixed income protocols today. And then there's also just the reality that locking up your capital for 3 months, 6 months in DeFi, I mean, that's how many cycles at this point. So there's just a lot of incentives against going down that route at the moment. And so that brings me to what we're building at Fiat DAO. And essentially, our view on kind of this topic was that the answer really lies in unlocking leverage for these positions. Similar to what kind of repo markets do in the real world, for those of you who have financial backgrounds. And so from a very simplistic 30,000-foot view, what essentially we've built with this protocol is a maker-style system in which you're actually able to bring supported collateral types and mint a singular asset called Fiat, short for fixed income asset token, because we like a good joke, and then go about your merry way for the duration of the bond. And so we've published a white paper on this that relates to the code base we're kind of putting into production next week. But essentially the idea is that through dynamic loan-to-value ratios, you can essentially support illiquid collateral types and allow users to mint a relatively liquid asset against them. If there's 6 months till maturity, you can mint less than if maturity is tomorrow. And what this winds up doing, it has a number of kind of emergent effects as a result. So by allowing you to mint fiat against your bond collateral, you can now go mint more bonds, to the extent that there's secondary liquidity for you to do so. So you're actually able to lever fixed income positions and get a larger fixed rate. Secondly, it reduces kind of the opportunity cost of using these protocols, because now instead of having to put up $100 to lock in 4, fiat allows you to put up $100 and do some multiple of that 4. And then on longer time frames, what I'm really interested in us kind of working on is this concept of what happens when you aggregate all these bonds into a singular protocol, right? Now it becomes a lot more straightforward maybe to do collateral swaps, or at least have like oracles for the interest rate information that is kind of endemic to these bonds you're holding. And so with all of that in mind, we view this as kind of being the first step of getting fixed income and DeFi on par with how systems operate in TradFi. And to those of you who have followed us to date, you'll know that we take quite a cue from MakerDAO. But we'll be releasing more information about kind of more medium-term goals for our protocol design that actually borrow from Aave and Curve as well. In particular, kind of like liquidity buffers. For those of you who are familiar with all those kind of concerns in the traditional markets, they're also here once you have all these illiquid assets. So that's kind of where our governance token and kind of additional utility will focus on. And so here I just included a quick kind of diagram of potential user flows for people who use fiat. And it's really this concept of 2 main pathways, right? If you have fiat, you can, if we have partners working with us, perhaps you can mint more assets against the fiat token itself. Or if there's deep enough secondary liquidity, you can sell that fiat token for more of the underlying. So in scenario A, you see an example where fiat theoretically could be a collateral type for Abracadabra. And so because Element Finance offers MIM-denominated bonds, you can actually imagine a flywheel effect here that would allow the user to lever their kind of fixed yield from Element. And then in scenario B, we take an example that would be secondary market denominated, meaning you take your fiat, you sell it for USDC, and you run it through Barnbridge and actually develop a levered fixed income position there. Now, leverage is a whole beast, as we all know, but one of the kind of realities that would emerge from these types of flywheels working effectively, rolled out in a responsible way, and of course, is that you would hope to see kind of like the borrowing costs go down over time, right? Because you're just attracting so much liquidity to these protocols by doing these types of pathways. And I think, at least it's my opinion that will do a lot for DeFi's role as being a real productive source of debt capital going forward. Just because 9% on stablecoin borrowing that's already over-collateralized makes sense if you're chasing crypto gains, but it doesn't really make sense if you're using that financing for real-world economic activity, right? Which is the ultimate goal, hopefully, of everyone building in DeFi. And now just a little bit of musing on my end. When we view kind of the landscape today for stablecoins or kind of the reserve currency category that's building out as well, we see a lot of different protocols competing for user attention or user liquidity. And to date, that mostly kind of resides in a very contemporary implementation, meaning if you're providing liquidity on Curve, you're getting those rewards bi-weekly. It doesn't matter how many times a protocol bribed in the past. If you stop bribing, your liquidity leaves. And so when we think about some of the language that has been used with Bitcoin in the past, specifically this idea of the Lindy effect, right? The longer something's been around, the harder it is to kill off. Fixed income, I think, will really serve that role for DeFi, whether it's like a stable coin trying to be the alpha, or any other types of assets that are trying to kind of like take on that more medium of exchange role. There really is something to be said for X amount of that supply is locked up for the next 6 months, for the next 12 months, right? Like stable coins that are locked away can't break your peg, and so on. And that's, I think, a pretty general view. There's obviously nuance that needs to be accounted for. But I really do think like the winners in a lot of these spaces will be determined kind of by their ability to work in fixed income protocols as a result. Now that all sounds great, but of course it does come with a lot of risk, which we've seen in the real world. Everyone's kind of familiar with like '08 financial crisis dramas and narratives at this point, presumably. If everyone tries to sell bonds or get out at the same time, right? The illiquidity of these assets really does manifest itself, primarily in huge discounts to what they were previously valued at, and so on. But I think the reality is that it just opens kind of like the avenue for opportunities for more DeFi innovation. And so I've listed a few points that we kind of keep in mind as we build out Fiat. And I'll just run through them real quick. So for example, underlier foreign exchange risk, right? Like what happens if you have an ETH denominated bond and ETH goes out the window, and now you can't really sell that position because you got to wait 3 months for it to unlock. That, I think, creates large demand for the services platforms like Ribbon Finance and DopeX provide with put options. And we ourselves are working on a partnership with Olympus DAO that kind of goes down this route of even repurchase agreements with the respective protocol that issued the underlying asset. Number 2 really excites me, which is this concept of, we're probably a few months out from DAOs starting to do like debt financing, given the speed at which DeFi is moving these days. And so that then opens kind of like the opportunity for credit default swap markets and all the, things that, again, that we have analogies with in TradFi markets. And then lastly, for runs on collateral, right? Like, for us at the protocol level, we recognize that there's a need for a certain liquidity buffer, for example. And so I think, backstop protocols are a very new kind of concept in DeFi, but you might be familiar with like just-in-time liquidity providers, or I think B protocol is one of the main backstop protocols in other lending markets at the moment. And so with all of this in mind, fixed income does bring with it new risk that I don't think DeFi is super familiar with these days. But given all the analogies we have and the work that has been done in DeFi over the past year, especially on the derivatives front, I would say I'm confident that these are risks that can be addressed. And so just to recap, we at Fiat DAO believe that fixed income hasn't been super appealing to the DeFi crowd, just due to the fact that the buck kind of stops once you take those positions. You can't really do much with them. And so we're looking to address this problem by offering a leverage protocol that essentially reduces the opportunity cost of entering those fixed income positions in the first place. And the hope is that by building out these types of solutions, both ourselves, and I'm sure we're not going to be the last that build in this direction, we all stand to benefit as greater and greater liquidity enters debt capital markets here in DeFi. And while that does come with risk, we've innovated our way through other risks in crypto, and I don't see that ending anytime soon. So I think we have a few minutes left for Q&A. If anyone has questions, I'd be happy to answer.